Hey, I'm Mikko. I don't usually do art exercises on this channel because I don't know what step you are in when it comes to your artistic progress. I'm going to make an exception here, simply because some people ask me to give a quick tip on how to begin creating pixel art on iPad. So if that's something you were looking for after my Procreate pixel art tutorial, this is for you. If you haven't yet done a 1 pixel brush, I suggest you watch that video first. When you start with a pixel art piece, the thing that will probably hit you like a truck is the amount of time it can take. There are multiple ways to narrow down the scope of what you're doing, and these won't just help you finish a piece, they'll help you learn the basics faster. Let's take a look at these methods, and spoiler alert, these aren't just exercises. In the end, I'm going to break down this process video into bits where you see me use each one of these techniques in my everyday normal workflow. Because who wants to make just exercises? This is a channel about making art, so let's make some art. I'm going to give some limitations here if that's okay, but it's important to note that these are not rules on how to do pixel art. It's art, there are no rules. These limitations will not make it easier to learn pixel art, but they will make it faster. I might have a relaxed attitude towards art, but when it comes to learning, I definitely would rather get to the fun part as fast as humanly possible. So let's get started. First thing to note is resolution. There are 2 ways to approach resolution. One approach is just to have a big canvas and decide the resolution based on just how many pixels you actually need. If you start a bigger pixel art piece this way, I'd recommend taking one of your characters as a starting point and let that determine the pixel height of other objects. If you want to do this in hardcore mode, here's the assignment. Have a canvas of only 32 × 32 pixels and try to simplify your character to the point where you can fit it into this small space. The reason why pixel art is so relatable is because people fill in the missing detail in their heads. But to let that happen, the artist, that is you have to let go of all detail that isn't absolutely necessary. The side benefit of all this is that it'll also make you a better illustrator, because you have to get real clear on what exactly your piece is about, because that story will answer all the questions of what should and what shouldn't be in your piece. Also smile, see how simple this was? This was the hardest part. You got this. Moving on, colors. There are 2 ways to approach colors too. One way is just to use whatever colors you want, because the size limitation might already feel very restricting. But for some people, colors might cause more, not less problems, so picking a specific palette for your piece might give you enough help to get to work. There are many ways to create palettes, but for this exercise, I recommend either taking a screenshot from an old pixel art game you like, or set a limitation for the shading of the piece related to the lighting of local colors. An extreme limitation might be, for example, I can only have local colors and shadows, that's all. No opacity blending. Pixels are sharp corners, and your eye is drawn to sharp edges in a composition. Therefore, shading an area with lots of low opacity brushes might feel safe, because you can avoid making big decisions. But in truth, you might be creating tons of sharp edges that are pulling the viewer's gaze to exactly the area you don't want them to be focusing on. So once again, we're being very clear on what the story of the illustration is and what we want to push to the center stage of your piece. And now we have tools to understand where people are looking. Quick tip. I'm not saying low opacity brushes aren't useful here. Obviously, I'm using them all the time. A fast way to find the color you're looking for is to mix it with low opacity brushes and then color pick that pixel that has the right color you're looking for. But after you've done this, tap the screen with 2 fingers to go back to a clean canvas. You don't want those other pixels making a mess without purpose. Remember that there's a color history accessible here, and on larger screens, you even have multiple hues that show the colors that were previously selected. This is handy if you accidentally color pick something else before you have a usable swatch or a brushstroke on screen. Then there's the question of outlines or no outlines. This one is entirely up to you, honestly. I only highlight this because when you're working with lower resolutions, space is extremely limited, and outlines take one whole pixels by themselves. Also, you don't really have to make a binary decision on outlines, because it's also possible to use them in only parts of your illustration. If you're using dark color for outlines, it will carve out that element from the background and add a lot of contrast to that area. So depending on what you're doing, this might work to your advantage. Let's say you're not using any outlines for background elements, but all characters have outlines to make them stand out. Especially if your goal is to design a look for a video game, this might be a handy tool to have to make people pay attention to the interactive elements on screen. Also, please note that if you do use full black outlines, you're free to make your own rule of how you go around the corners. Here's one example of fully black outlines circling the edges, and then a more economic way that retains more of the original silhouette. Usually I personally don't use a lot of black in my finished pieces, but there's a reason why black lines can be useful too. When your piece is done and you have reserved black for only a few areas, like for example outlines, you can use an extremely dark color that is almost but not quite black. Fill an entire new layer with that color and then set the blending mode to lighten. This can unify the look of the piece, and it won't mess up the other colors if this lighten layer hue is the darkest hue after black on your screen. Obviously this is not necessary, and it's just a tool I use at the final editing phases of a piece. Now let's look at these three assignments in order that makes most sense. First, do a character in small scale, 32 by 32 pixels. Design the look of the colors with a limited color palette. Don't overthink this part. Palette doesn't mean that they can't be changed later. If you look at the birds in this illustration, I totally did 180 on my own decisions, because once there were enough finished elements in the illustration itself kindly informs what it needs. And I just adjust based on that new information that I have. You have your main element, you have your colors, now you can expand these skills to a full illustration. One more tip about this illustration phase, and I cannot stress this next bit enough. After you've done these two exercises of character creation and making a palette for your scene, I highly recommend that you limit the amount of pixels you give yourself for the final illustration. Trust me on this, guys. Start small. This illustration is Game Boy Color resolution, which is 160 times 140 pixels. It might sound very small, but this illustration already has taken me a ton of time. More pixels don't make this process easier, and especially when learning this stuff, it'll be harder to learn pixel art specifically if the methods to create shapes are too close to normal digital painting and not limited to the methods of pixel art, which is mostly a lot of problem solving in small scale. Also, there's more advice on resolution and handy chart on old game console resolutions in this video. Now, if you paid attention to the process video during this talk, you probably noticed that I go through all of these steps in my normal process. I outline the composition with quick black lines. These aren't precise, I just need to see what the character height is. Then I immediately try to solve the characters first, because they're essential for this specific illustration, and the shape they require on this canvas define the scale of all other objects on screen. What size is an espresso machine in an old coffee shop anyway? I can't answer that question before I know the size of these little birds first. When color blocking, I start with the reduced color palette. Even the characters are done with only local colors first. As the objects start finding their own place, only then I add more lights and hue variety, because the illustration is informing me where I have visual space for extra pixels. This wall of the coffee shop, for example, doesn't have any detail in it, because I know that these non-linear shading lines are already holding enough attention for what the wall is worth. Cracked paint, which I love to do in my illustrations, would be thematically consistent if I did it on this wall, but I know that it would probably get too busy, and I don't want the texture to be competing with this character. I'm making this video on my birthday, and I just wanted to thank all of you for being here and seeing my videos. I don't always say this, but I really appreciate the few of you who have left comments on my videos. That really helps this channel and makes it possible for me to reach more people with these uploads. If you learned something on my channel, consider subscribing. YouTube considers subscription these days like a vague suggestion, so pressing the bell will make it easier to see when I have new videos up or when I'm painting live. But to those who are not doing either of those things, thank you anyway, and I hope you go and create lots of fun art that gives you a lot of joy. I'm Mikko, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!